Hello. If you're watching this video, it means that unfortunately I haven't been able to make it over to APSA in person this year. It really is hard to express how disappointed I am that I can't be at the panel. It just wasn't possible. I've explained the reasons to Yifta and Genevieve, who've been very understanding, and I hope there'll be opportunities in the future, either in APSA or somewhere else along the line or wherever. So I've read the other three papers with great interest. I'd have loved to have been there to have heard them live and to join in the discussion. So enjoy. Hope you have a great time. Okay, on to my paper. My broad motivation has been to address a long-standing and widely spread misnomer about Mary Wollstonecraft's philosophy, which is that effectively what she was doing was to demand for women the same rights that men had. Now, that's clearly right at the most superficial level. She did do that. But to put it this way, as it often is, belies the complex theoretical innovations that she had to introduce in order for that demand to be realizable. So if you treat Wollstonecraft as a Republican, for example, as I do, then the tone of some of the commentaries is that it was men who identified, worked out, and defended the essential Republican principles, there being no other woman that's really ever mentioned in Republicans' history, and that's another issue for another day. But women are thought to have come along and said, well, we'd like some of that too. Men work out the theory, women want to apply it to them as well as to men. So Wollstonecraft is seen as applying Republican principles to people like herself, but she's not seen, often, at least amongst these scholars that I'm talking about, the sort of Republican theorists, she's not seen as having made a theoretical contribution to Republican theory itself, only to the way it's applied. And you don't have to see her as a Republican in particular for this same misnomer to become apparent. The same thing often happens, I find, in discussions, no matter what theoretical tradition people come from when they're talking about Wollstonecraft. So I've taken as my example, an example of what I'm talking about, an illustration that Philip Pettit, a Republican scholar, frequently uses in discussing the feminist credentials of the Republican model, which he is all for. He thinks this is a great selling point, and he brings up Wollstonecraft's name. But the example he prefers to use and uses most often is that of the story of Nora and Torvald in Ibsen's Doll's House. And the message that he elicits from that is one that he attributes to Wollstonecraft as well. And I'm not going to say, by the way, that Pettit is wrong specifically in the particularities of what he says, only that as far as Wollstonecraft and Ibsen go, it's very limited. And what's interesting about the Doll's House allusion is that Wollstonecraft herself does use the image of women as dolls, only once to my knowledge, but it is a far richer and more expansive metaphor than Pettit attributes to her. And Wollstonecraft has also been linked with Ibsen's play at least once before before Pettit's treatment, which was in the 1890s, which was the centenary of the Vindication, which coincided, the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, obviously, it coincided with the staging of The Doll's House as a play in London. It had been written some years before, obviously performed in Norway and maybe elsewhere, but the London sort of premiere, debut, whatever, was at that time. And two commentators picked up on this, something that I was made aware of through Eileen's wonderful Portraits of Wollstonecraft volumes, which I'm very grateful. It's an amazing sort of set of volumes, and I'm sure many of you will be benefiting from that already. Elizabeth Pennell Robbins and Millicent Garrett Fawcett both wrote introductions to sort of rival editions of the centennial editions, celebratory editions of the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and both made substantially the same point. I'll get onto that a bit later, in drawing attention to the Doll's House and Wollstonecraft's use of dolls as an image. They were closer, in my view, to what Wollstonecraft argued, although once again, Wollstonecraft is still far more subtle than either of them. And they're not philosophers. I shouldn't sort of draw them into this sort of discussion. They have different backgrounds, different skills, different aims. But nevertheless, it's an interesting point, and I think it's very helpful with studying Wollstonecraft. So Petit's use of the image of the doll's house is focused on illustrating the principle that Republican freedom represents resilient protection against arbitrary power. This is the kind of standard core fundamental principle of neo-republicanism, something Petit emphasizes a great deal. It's not enough, he says, that Nora, the principal character in Ibsen's play, is able to do what she likes for the most part. She happens to have a loving husband who doesn't wish to control his wife's behavior, even though he has the legal power to do so. That's not enough to make her free. It makes her, in Republican terms, a lucky slave. Nora is still a slave because she doesn't act in her own right as a citizen. Instead, she relies on the goodwill of the man who has power over her husband. This power, again in Republican terms, is arbitrary. Nora doesn't have effective control over Torvald's power. He exercises it at his own discretion, having, as Petit says, the cultural and legal right to determine what she wears, who she meets, how she runs the household, and so on. So Torvald is under power. He's under the power of the law, but the law is constrained, and Torvald has the right and ability to control or push back against the power of the law through the representation process, of which he's a citizen. So the power over him is one in which he's represented. That is not true of Nora. So that's the difference. Nora bristles at this situation. That's the point of the play. What she wants is not to be able to get away with doing whatever she wants. What she's upset about is that she's not authorized or empowered by right to do what she pleases. She has to rely both on fortunate external circumstances, and she also has to conform to broad social expectations about what is seemly for a woman. So it's a double bind. Now, Wollstonecraft certainly does endorse substantially this point. She condemns, for example, the fact that women have to act according to the will of another fallible being, their husbands or fathers, and submit, right or wrong, to his power. So she's describing the arbitrary power that Nora is under. In this context, Petit says explicitly that Wollstonecraft's achievement was to make a powerful case for extending this Republican ideal to women as well as men. So he's making clear that that's what he sees her contribution as. I mean, it could be that elsewhere he says lots of other things about what a wider contribution is, but in fact doesn't. And so this, in my view, oversimplifies her achievement. She didn't aim to extend the simple neo-Republican model of freedom as non-domination to women, although that is no small thing. I'm not trying to belittle the idea that it took women a lot of arguing and a lot of conceptual sort of breakthroughs in order to see that women deserved the same treatment as men. That is a big deal, but it is a different deal from what Wollstonecraft had to do. And it also seems a little bit less than, to say that men thought up the theory and then women realized that it should apply to them. There's an asymmetry there, although we must remember that that is not a small thing. So I don't mean to be dismissive of that, but that is not all that Wollstonecraft did. She had to critique and rework how the Republican model was understood before she could then argue for its extension. So there's a theoretical contribution to the intellectual framework, the principles that govern republicanism, and then there is the application that women must enjoy the same rights. So we need to sort of understand that this theoretical work was done by women. The metaphor of women as dolls shows this very clearly. Both Pennell and Fawcett highlight how Wollstonecraft emphasizes the falseness, is the word that they both use, the falseness of women's lives. Women's lives were tightly controlled by social standards that were not governed by rational or moral principles, at least not in the light of the natural law to which Wollstonecraft and her readers subscribed. Since these principles were held out to be natural, moral, and rational, they were, in fact, to use Pennell's term, sham principles. They were fake. They were held out to be something which they were not. They were fictions and falsehoods. Secondly, women were not able to govern their lives according to their own ideas about what was in their interests. Their lives were, therefore, inauthentic. Fawcett goes further. In order to demonstrate that they were conforming to the false principles, women had to, indeed they were expressly advised to, practice dissimulation, deliberately creating the false impression that they lived up to social standards because, in all honesty, that was all that mattered, appearances. Appearance, behaviour, decorum, the applause of Mrs. Grundy, constant attention to keep the varnish fresh, Fawcett observes. These are set before women as ends to be sedulously sought for on account of their bearing on the grand aim of women's existence, the admiration of the other sex. So women's only sort of role was to be admired by men, effectively. But to this end, everything else was to be subordinated, and, Fawcett adds, they must never openly avow it. So there's one aim that they have: be admired, find a man. That's what they have to do, but they are advised, counselled, required to deny that's even what they're interested in. So there's dissimulation built into the very concept of what a woman is. The whole premise is one of falsehood. So the idea of virtue, that men have civic virtue, standing up for what they believe in principle and so on, that doesn't apply to women because their very essence requires them to deceive people as to what they're really trying to do. They can't stand up for principle because that is the opposite of what a woman is supposed to be. So not only were women's lives based on a set of falsehoods and shams, the very conception of being a woman demanded that this be so. And everyone understood it. Just be seen to conform and everything will be okay. Everyone knows it's a sham. Just play along. This, as I've just said, is incompatible with the role of a citizen. A Republican citizen must act independently, on principle, defying public opinion if necessary, because only this kind of boldness can protect the freedom of the Republican state. It is exactly this point that Wollstonecraft is making when she invokes the image of dolls. And it's a famous quotation, actually, that the doll's image comes in. It's not often sort of mentioned, but it is actually a well-known quote. The being, Wollstonecraft writes, who discharges the duties of its station is independent. And speaking of women at large, their first duty is to themselves as rational creatures, and the next, in point of importance, as citizens, is that which includes so many of a mother. That's the sort of famous bit, but then she goes on, the rank in life, which dispenses with their fulfilling this duty, necessarily degrades them by making them mere dolls. Dolls, in this sense, are slaves. That's another image and concept that Wollstonecraft continually invokes with respect to women. Slaves, too, must conform to an expected stereotype. In their case, docile, loyal, stupid, and so on. It's not that far from what women have to do. But the idea of women as dolls adds a specific emphasis. So it's not just that they have to be meek and submissive and charming and all this sort of stuff. There's a specific emphasis. Women are created for the amusement and pleasure of men as mere playthings. Pennell puts it this way: let woman be herself and not a mere automaton, pretty to look at, with no other object in existence save to gratify the whims and passions of man. Now, we might agree with this social analysis, but ask specifically what has it got to do with the Republican context that Pettit is talking about. You might say, yes, well, Wollstonecraft's done this fantastic social analysis and that is good in itself, and I would agree that that is good in itself and that is fantastic, but it is also theoretically relevant for the principles of this specific political philosophy, and I think in other cases as well it would be the same. Different political philosophies would still find room for this analysis to challenge their fundamental principles. So that would be an excellent question, because what she's doing is casting doubt on the very ability of the Republican model to deliver the freedom it promises, unless it can find theoretical room to account for not just the excesses and overreach of state power, but also of cultural pressures too. Now, that is a contemporary idea that Republicans are preoccupied by now and are working at, sort of at conferences like this. But it is not part of the standard traditional conception of where we think we get republicanism from. So, to modify the subtitle of Pettit's first book on the subject, Republicanism is not just a theory of freedom and government, that's the traditional view, but the Wollstonecraftian view that it is also a theory of freedom, society, and government. And that needs theoretical sort of integration into the Republican model, which I think Wollstonecraft does to great effect, but that's a separate story. Now, of course, no Republican is going to deny that social conditions are important, but the question is how to incorporate them into the model. As I say, that's a tricky issue. Republicans rely extensively on an ideal of public reason to regulate the institutions which protect our freedom. Wollstonecraft's achievement was to demonstrate just how much this takes for granted. And I think some of the other papers, particularly I think Yifter and Genevieve's wonderful paper, but they're all great. But those two I think do specifically touch on this issue, and I was delighted to read that. How much they take for granted, just how extensively we must engage on a wholesale reconstruction of our conceptual world, a collaborative venture with men and women working together, remaking a social context that represents them both, before the process of applying the Republican principles that Pettit speaks of can even begin. Now, I can see that I've been going on for just 16 minutes. I think 15 was my target. I think 15 is about what you can handle. So I'm going to say goodbye there. I really wish I could hear the discussion. Perhaps someone will secretly record it or something. I don't know. I'd love to be part of it. If anyone wants to email me or write to me, I would be delighted to correspond. And I may offer some thoughts privately to some of the other panelists. In the meantime, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for putting up with this video. And I just hope you have a wonderful time. And yeah, perhaps we'll be in touch. Okay, bye-bye.